This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by CBT Nuggets and Lumigo. On this episode, I chat with Amy Arambulo Negrette about creating and evolving technical content. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 102. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Daly, and this is Serverless Chats. Today, I'm joined by Amy Arambulo Negrette. Hey, Amy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you are a cloud economist at the Duckbill Group. So I'd love it if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at the Duckbill Group.
Sure thing. I used to be an application developer. I did a bunch of AWS stuff for a while, and now at the Duckbill Group, a cloud economist is someone who goes through Cost Explorer and your usage report and tries to figure out where you're spending too much money and how the best to help you. It is the best known use of a small skill I have, which is about being able to dig through someone's receipts and find out what their story is.
Sounds like a forensic accountant, maybe forensic cloud economist or something to that effect.
Yep, that's basically what we do.
So I'm super excited to have you here. First of all, I have to ask this question. I've known Corey for quite some time, and I can imagine that working with him is either amazing or an absolute nightmare. So I'm just curious, which one is it?
It is not my job to control Corey, so it's great. He's great to talk to. He really is fully engaged in any conversation you have with him. You've talked to him before. I'm sure you know that.
Right.
And he loves knowing what other people think on things, which I think is a really healthy attitude to have.
Totally agree, and hopefully he will subtweet this episode. So, so getting into this episode, so one of the things that I've noticed that you've done quite a bit is you create technical content. I've seen a lot of the talks that you've given, and I think that's something that you've done such a great job of not only sort of coming up with content and making content interesting. I mean, that's sometimes when you put together technical content, it's not super exciting. But you have a very good way of sort of taking that technical content and making it interesting. But then also sort of following up with it, right? I mean, you have this series of talks where you started, talking about managing, FaaS, and then sort of like then you went to the whole frenemies thing with Fargate versus, Lambda. And now we're talking about, I think the latest one you did was about Lambdas, and the container support within Lambda. So, maybe we can just sort of go back or start at a point where we're kind of, for people who are interested in maybe doing talks, like what is the reason for, even creating some of these talks in the first place?
I feel a lot of engineers have the same problem just day to day where they will run into a bug and then they'll go hit the all-knowing software engineer, which is the Google search engine, and have absolutely either nothing come up or have 6 posts that say, I'm having this problem, but you won't ever get an answer. This is just a fast way of answering those questions before someone has to ask it.
Right. And so when you sort of come up with these, so you run into this bug and you're thinking to yourself, you can't find the answer. So you do the research, you spend the time sort of digging through and finding, the right way to solve it. So when you put these talks together, do you get a sense that it's helping people and that it's just another way to sort of connect with the community?
Yeah. When I do it, it's really great because after a talk, I'll see people either in the hallway or I'll meet someone at a booth and they'll even say, it's like, I ran into this exact same problem and I gave up because it was such a strange edge case that it was too hard to fix and we just moved on to another solution, which is entirely possible. And I also get to express to just the general public that I do, in fact, know what I'm talking about because someone has given me a stage to talk for 30 minutes and just put up all of my proofs. And that's a actually fun and weirdly empowering place to be.
Yeah, no, I actually think that's really interesting. And I again, for me, I loved your talks, right? And that some of those things are sort of. I put those things at the back of my mind, but I know for people who give talks who maybe get judged for other reasons or whatever, that it certainly is empowering. And is that something where you certainly shouldn't have to do it, right? I mean, there certainly should be, that same level of respect. But is that something that you found that doing these talks really sort of just sets the tone right off the bat?
Yeah, I feel it does. It helps that when someone Googles you, a bunch of YouTube videos on how to solve their problem comes up. That is extremely helpful, especially when I do a lot of consulting. So if I ever have to go on site and someone wants to know what I do, I can pull up an actual YouTube playlist of things that I've done, which is
right.
It's like being in developer relations. Without having to write all of that content, I get to write a fraction of that content.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's and unfortunately that is a fact that we live with right now, which is completely unfair. But I think that again, the fact that you do that, you put that out there, and that gives you that credibility, which again you should have from your resume. But at the same time, I think it's an interesting way, to sort of circumvent that, given the current world we live in.
It also helps when there are either younger engineers or even other younger professionals who are looking at the tech industry, and the tech industry, especially right now, does not have the best reputation, to be able to see that there are people who are from different backgrounds, either educationally or financially or what have you, and are able to go out and see someone who has something similar being a subject matter expert in whatever it is that they're talking about.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that, and that's that thing where the more that we can sort of amplify those types of voices and make sure that people can see that diversity, it's incredibly important. So good for you, obviously, for pushing through that, because I know that I've heard a lot of horror stories around that stuff that makes my blood boil. So let's talk to some of these people out here who potentially want to do some of these talks, and want to use this as a way to again sell themselves. Because I can tell you one thing. Until once I started writing blog posts and doing talks and doing those sort of things, clearly I have a very different background. But it just gave me a bunch of exposure, right? And so job offers and consulting clients and things like that, those just become much easier to get when you can actually go out there and do some of this stuff. So if you're interested in doing that, I think one of the hard things for most people is, what even makes a good talk, right? So you've come up with some really great talks. So what is that? What's that secret sauce? How do you do that?
I think it can also be very intimidating, since a lot of the talks that get a lot of promotion are always huge vendor events that they're trying to push a product, they're trying to push a solution, and that usually takes up a lot of advertising real estate, essentially, where that's what you see on the threads and everything. When you actually get to these community conferences, or even when I would speak at AWS Summit, I had a very specific problem that I needed to solve. Mm-hmm. I ran into a bug. The bug was not in the documentation, because why would it be?
Why would you put that in there? Right.
Of course. And then Google, 3 pages down, maybe put me on the path to finding the right answer. And it's the journey of trying to put all of the bug fixes in place to make it work for your specific environment, and then being able to share that.
Right. Yeah. And so that idea of sort of taking these these experiences that you've had, or trying to solve a problem, and then finding the nuances maybe in solving the problem, as opposed to the happy path, which it's always great when you're following a blog post and it says, run this command, then run this command, then run this command. Well, what happens on that third command when the thing blows up and you have no idea? You have no idea what to do, and then you end up Googling for 5 hours trying to find your way out of that. So, you take this, this sort of path of, find those bugs or find that non-happy path, and solve it. So then what do you do around there? How do you then take that? You got to make that interesting somehow.
Yes. A lot of people use GIFs and memes. I use pictures of food and screen caps from Dungeons and Dragons. And that's usually just different enough that it'll snap someone just out of their phone going, why is there a huge elf on my screen trying to attack people, screaming elf error? And it's like, well, that's because that's what they thought it would be great to call it. It's not a great error code. It doesn't explain what it is, and it makes you very confused.
Right. And so part of that is, and again, there's that relatability when you create talks and you want to connect with the audience in some way. But you also, this is the other thing that I've always found the hardest when I'm creating talks, is trying to find the right level. Like what's, you know what I mean? Because AWS always does this thing where they're like, oh, it's a 200 level or it's a 400 level and so forth. And I think that's helpful, but you're going to get people of all different, all different skill levels and so forth. So how do you do that? How do you take a problem like that and then make it relatable? Or understandable, probably.
Yeah,
find that right level.
The way I see it, there's going to be at least one person of these two types in the room that are not going to be your target audience. Someone who doesn't know what you're talking about, but sees that a tool that they're considering is going to pose a problem and they want to know how difficult it is to fix it. Or there's going to be a business person who has no technical background, and they just want to know if what they're evaluating is worth evaluating, if this error is going to be so difficult to narrow down and try to resolve that, why would we go through something that my engineers are going to spend hours to try to fix something that's essentially a configuration issue? So when I write any section of a talk, I make sure that it addresses a person who may not have come into that with that exact problem in mind. Mm-hmm. For the people who have, they'll understand in animation it's called key images, where there are very specific slots where you understand the topic of what is happening and the context around it. And I always produce more verbose notes that go with my presentation. I usually release it either at the end of the day or later on that week once everyone has had time to settle. And it provides a tutorial-esque experience where this is what you saw. This is how you would actually do it if you were in front of a screen.
Yeah.
There are people who go to technical talks with a laptop on their lap because they're also working while they're trying to do it.
Right.
But most of the time, they're not going to have the console open while you're walking through the demo. So how are you going to address that issue? It's just easier that way.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that idea too. I know I try to do like high level bullet points and then talk about the bullet point, because one thing that I try to do, and I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Here I am picking your brain, trying to make my own talks better. But like basically, I do a bullet point and then I talk through it, and I actually animate the bullet points coming in. So I'm not a huge fan of showing an entire slide with all the bullet points and then letting people read ahead. I sort of bring a bullet point in, talk about the bullet point, bring another bullet point in. Is that something you recommend doing too, or do you just kind of present, sort of all the concepts and then walk people through it?
I think it depends. I tend to have very dense slides, which is not great for reading, especially if you're several rows back. Yeah, and I truly understand that. But the way I see it, because I also talk very fast when I'm on stage, that I want there to be enough context around what's happening so that if I gloss over a concept, then you visually can understand what's happening. That said, if that's because the entire bullet block on my slide is going to be about a very specific thing that's happening. So it's not something that you have to view step by step. Now, I do have a few where, especially in a more workshop scenario where you're going, I want you to think about this first and then go on to this next concept. I totally hide stuff. I just discovered for a talk that I was constructing the other day that there's an animation that drops them down like index cards, and that's now my favorite animation right now.
So when you're doing that, because this is the other thing, just for people who have ever, if you're out there and you've ever written a talk or you've given a talk, the first iteration of it is never going to be the right one, right? You have to go through and you have to sort of revise. And it's sort of weird, and I don't know, maybe you felt this way too, in the pre-pandemic world, when you would give talks in person, most of the time, you'd give it to a relatively small audience, a couple hundred people or whatever, as opposed to now when we do talks, post-pandemic and they're online, it's like they're immediately available online. So it's hard to give the same talk over and over and over and over again without somebody potentially having seen it. And a lot of work goes into a single talk. So not being able to use the same talk over and over again is not great. But like, how do you refine it? Is it something that you test with, you tested it with a live audience, or do you use like a family member or a friend or a colleague? Like, how do you test and refine your talks?
I'm actually an organizer at a meetup group, specifically built around giving people of marginalized gender identities and a place to stage and write technical content. It is a very specific audience.
I can imagine.
But it is it addresses that issue I had earlier about visibility. It also does help you if you don't have a lot of contacts in this industry. Just as an aside, technical speaking is a great way to do it because everyone loves talking to each other after the stress has worn off, and you become the friendliest person after you've done that. But also, there are meetup groups out there specifically about doing technical feedback or just general speaking feedback. If you want to do something general, Toastmasters is a great organization to do. If you want to do strictly technical, if you do any cloud related stuff, the DevOps communities are super friendly, even if it's not specifically about DevOps. I'm not a DevOps person, but I have a lot of DevOps friends. Some of my best friends are DevOps people. And it's like you can get on a meetup or a Zoom call and just burn through your slides for about 10 or 15 minutes and see. Your friends will be very honest with you in a small group.
Right. One of the things I did notice too, giving a speech in person or giving a talk in person versus giving a talk via Zoom call, is sometimes when you don't hear any laughs or chuckles from a little joke that you make in there, it can feel very lonely in that space after you're waiting for something in there. But it's a little bit
worse when there are people in the room.
And they don't laugh, right?
So much worse.
That is very true. If something falls flat, right? Yeah, that's a good point. Hi, everyone. I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, CBT Nuggets. Now, if you're an IT professional or a developer like me, you know how important it is to constantly be learning new skills to keep up with the latest trends. Now, sometimes a blog post or a YouTube tutorial can get you started, but if I really want to upskill, nothing compares to professional training from experts you can trust. And with CBT Nuggets, I have access to more than 400 courses and over 4,000 hours of professional training. And with a 100% in-house training team, they add 40 hours of new training every week. Now, their courses feature topics ranging from building serverless apps with Lambda and DynamoDB to certification-focused training for AWS, Microsoft, Linux, and more. And CBT Nuggets also offers virtual labs so you can practice your new skills as you're learning them. They also have accountability coaching, which lets you talk to a real person to create custom learning paths to set goals and keep you accountable. So whether you're a developer looking to sharpen your skills or a team looking to level up together, you can try CBT Nuggets for free for 7 days thanks to their free trial offer. Just visit cbtnuggets.com/serverless and sign up to get started. So how, just going back to more this idea of creating good talks and what makes a good talk, where do you find, you mentioned like, maybe for it's a vendor conference or something like that, and you try to, maybe install the vendor stuff and you find the bugs and so forth. But like, are there any other places that you get inspiration from, or, where, like, are there any resources you use to sort of build some of these talks?
Again, the communities help. The communities will tell you, really, it's like, I don't understand this thing. Can someone like hop on a call with me for a real quick minute and explain why this concept is so hard? And that's that's a very good place to base a talk off. As far as making them engaging and interesting, I tend to clone video gaming videos just because that's what I watch. So I know if it's going to be interesting to me, then it will probably be at least different than the content that's out there.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to sort of think of things too. Is if it's something that you find interesting, chances are there are lots of other people that will find that interesting. So, all right. So let's go back to sort of just this idea of creating new talks. And you had mentioned this idea of again finding the bugs and so forth. But one of the things that I think we see quite a bit is always that bleeding edge stuff, right? Like people are always want to write content about something new that happened, and I'm guilty of this. I would think from serverless standpoint, where you're sort of talking about things that are like really like bleeding edge, and it's useful and they're interesting, and certainly if you go to a conference about serverless, that it's really nice to see these talks and what might be possible. But sometimes when you're going to more practical type things, like again even like DevOps days and some of those other things, I think you've got a lot of attendees or talk listeners who are looking for very practical advice. So I guess the question is like, how do you sort of take a new piece of content, one of these problems, whatever it is, I guess, how do you keep finding new content is probably the better way to ask that question.
Oof. Well, to just roll back just a little bit. So my problem with bleeding edge content, I love watching it, but bleeding edge content will almost always be a product demo. Because it's someone who developed a new solution and they want to share with everybody, which is just going to walk you through how it's used, which is great, except, and this is just a nature of what the cloud industry is like, all of this stuff changes day to day. Right. So these tools may not be applicable in a few months, or they may become the new standards. There's no way to tell until you're already 6 months out, and by then they've already gone through several product revisions. I once did a talk where I was talking about best practices, and AWS released their updated best practices the day before my talk, and I had to update 3 slides. It threw off my timing. It was great. But that's just one of those kind of pitfalls that you have to roll with. As far as getting new content, though, especially if you're it depends who your audience is, because my audience tends to be either like ICs or technical leads, and by then you're usually in a company. If you're not developing these bleeding edge solutions, you're just using the tools that's out there already. Mm-hmm. So, like you had brought up my serverless frenemies, which is still my favorite title of any talk that I've ever made. Because when I did the managing containers one, and I love all my DevRel friends, but they all got into my mentions about why don't you just use Fargate? If you're at the containerization stage, why don't you just use Fargate? Like, cause it's not even close to the same thing. It is closer to Kubernetes than it is to Lambda, and I'm looking for a Lambda-like solution. So that's what that whole deal was about, and I was able to stretch that out into, I think, 30 minutes. Because Twitter will tell you what's wrong, whether or not it's accurate or not.
Right, exactly.
And whether or not they're actually your friends. They are my friends, Twitter... but come on.
Yeah, Twitter can definitely be brutal. So I think that, and maybe unpack a little bit what you were sort of saying is you're creating content around existing tools, and so. I mean, as you sort of, if you're, or one way to do it is to, you're using existing tools, you're creating content around that, or you can create content around that. Looking at those solutions, you introduce a new solution to something, or you're even using an existing tool. Nothing's perfect, right? So you had mentioned that idea of bugs and so forth, but just like, I guess new solutions or just solutions in general, maybe higher level abstractions, everything creates some new type of problem that you have to deal with. Yeah. And that's probably a pretty effective way to sort of generate new content.
It is. If you ever have to write down an RCA or which for those who have not had the pleasure of doing one, is called a root cause analysis, where you took down production and you had to explain why.
Right. Yep.
Or you ever did this hopefully in stage or hopefully in development, where you ran into a situation where, I don't know, I had a situation once where a Lambda would not delete itself. I call it my Skynet problem, where it just hit a stage where it was both trying to save and delete at the same time. And it would lock itself, and I had to destroy the entire stack and send that command several times just to make that force that command through. If you ever have a problem like that, that is a thing that you write up instantly, and then you turn it into slide decks, and then you you go to Slides Carnival, you throw a very flashy background on it, and next thing you know, you have a TED Talk or a technical talk.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing too is I find use cases to be an interesting, just like and non-traditional use cases are kind of fun too. Like, how can I use this in a way that it wasn't meant to be used and do something? I
love those. Those are my favorite. I love watching people break away from what the tutorial says you have to do, and I'm going to get a little weird with it. And that to me is totally fascinating. When the whole I fed these scripts into a computer meme came out, I thought that was super fascinating, because that was something a company I had worked for did. They used analytics. I used to work for Fantasy Sports to write color commentary for your fantasy football team. And they would send it out. So if you did really well, you would get a really raving review. And if you did really poorly, you would get roasted by a computer. And then that gets sent to everyone in the league. And it's hilarious. But that is not a thing that you would just assume a computer would do. It's just write hot takes on your fantasy football team.
That's sorry, go ahead.
It's so much fun. I love watching people get weird with the tools that are there.
So there are times where you could do something like that. You could maybe create a content around, some strange use case or whatever. And I love that idea of getting weird with that. The other part of it though is that, like, I guess if you're sitting through a talk and it's some super interesting problem that you're listening to, and again, I don't know, maybe it's some database replication thing that you're just really into, whatever, that makes sense. But I think the majority of problems that developers have are not that interesting. They're just frustrating, Yeah. And probably the worst thing to do is wanting to sit through a talk that talks about some frustrating issue you have. So is there a way to basically say, look, I have a problem that I want to talk about. It's not a very interesting, it's not the most interesting problem, but how can you sort of flip that and take a problem that's not interesting and make it interesting?
So the managing containers and the frenemies talk was all based off of a bin library error from within the Lambda AMI. And that on paper is extremely boring and should be a thing that you can easily look up. It is not. So when I went around trying to make tracking down library errors interesting. Just saying it is very slow and can kind of drain the energy out of your voice. But I put a lot of energy into my work in general. And that's just how I had to approach building these talks. It's like, you know what? I like what I do just generally. And when I try to explain what I do to people, it sounds super boring. And I own that. And now I'm doing it with spreadsheets, which is much, much worse. But when I tell people, it's like, it's not about the error itself. It's about everything that happened to make this one particular error happen. Mm-hmm. The reason why this error happened was because Lambda uses AWS's very specific Linux AMI when they did not used to. And they left stuff out for either security or performance purposes. And whether or not we as a group agree with that, that's just a decision, that's a business decision that they made. So how does their business decision affect your future business decisions and your future technical ones? Well, that becomes a way more interesting conversation because it's like, we know this is going to break at this part. Do we still want to use SSH? Do we still need it for this reason? Yeah. And then you can approach it more from a narrative standpoint of, I wasted way too much time with this. Did I need to? It's like, well, you shouldn't have. This should not have happened, but no bug should have happened, right? Right. So you work through your process of finding a solution instead of concentrating on what the solution is, because the solution they can look up in your show notes later. Right.
Yeah. No, I love that idea of sort of documenting your process as opposed to just the solution itself. I mean, that you find the problem, you pull the thread, and where does that take you? I think to myself, a lot of times I go down the rabbit hole on trying to find the answer to or the solution to a problem that I have, or a bug fix or whatever. Sometimes the resolution is underwhelming, and so maybe it's not worth sharing. But other times, there's sort of a revelation in there, and I think you're right. With a little bit of storytelling, you can usually take that and turn that into a really interesting talk.
One of the things it will also do, if you look at it from a process and from a narrative standpoint, is that when you take this video and you send it to either a technical lead or a product manager, they'll understand what the problem was because you did not bog it down with code. Right. There's very little live code in mine because I understand that people build things differently just because every code is as different as every person. And I get that, and I've come to terms with it. So this is the best way to share that information.
Absolutely. So, all right. So let's wrap up the idea of building talks. So, what would be your what are your advice to someone who is starting out new? Like, what's the best way for them to get started, or what's just some sort of general advice for people starting to build talks?
The best content new engineers can do, and that's mostly because this is never the standpoint from which tutorials are ever written in, is that as someone who knows very little of the way a language or a framework should work, write down your process, and I mean the entire thing, on you getting either a framework onboarded, how you build a messaging system, things that people have written a billion times. Because chances are, one, you got that work from someone else's blog post or their documentation, and you can cite that. And two, when you do it that way, you not only get into the habit of writing, but you get in the habit of editing it in a way that makes it more palatable for people who are not in your specific experience. And when you do it this way, people can actually see from an outsider's perspective exactly what is hard about the thing that they built, or what people who do not have a different level of experience are going through. So if a tutorial is targeted at engineers who know where the memory leaks in PHP are, that's a thing that comes with experience. That is not a thing that can be trained. Right. So, when a new engineer hits that point and they found it in a new framework where you fix it, then start knowing where to fix other problems. So that way more senior engineers and more vetted people can learn from your experience, and then they will contact you and they will teach you how to find these issues so you don't run into them again. And you end up with someone you can just bounce off ideas off of. And that's how you get pulled into these technical communities. So it's a really self-fulfilling process.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think this idea of you approaching something from a slightly different angle, your experience, the way that you do it, the way that you see it, the way that you perceive the word or the next prompt that comes back, or how you read an error message or any of those things, you sharing your experience around that is hugely valuable to the people that are building these things. But also,
totally.
You may run into problems that other people like you run into, and it's just and sometimes all it takes is just a tiny twisting of the words, rearranging a sentence in a way that now that clicks with somebody where the other time it didn't. And I love that. That's why I always encourage people, just even if somebody has written content 100 times before, your content, whatever slight difference there is in your content, that could have a powerful effect on someone else.
Yeah, it really can.
Hi, everyone. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Lumigo. We've talked a lot about observability on this podcast, and if you've listened to any of those episodes, then you know that it can be difficult to achieve serverless observability with traditional approaches. Now, serverless comes with many opportunities and advantages, and it also has some unique issues that some tools just aren't able to address, and those issues really need something meant for serverless environments. That's where Lumigo comes in. As a serverless-first monitoring platform, Lumigo lets developers quickly and easily find and fix errors and performance issues, while also giving you an end-to-end view of the entire transaction across services and functions. All of the debugging information you need is conveniently in one place, and you're able to set up alerts so you know what's happening and how it might affect the user experience. Lumigo also knows how to play nice with your existing toolchain, enabling you to send alerts to email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Ops Genie, and more, and can also create tickets in Jira straight from the issues page. Thanks to their automatic distributed tracing, it only takes 4 clicks to set up Lumigo with no manual code changes necessary. Lumigo already has a free plan that lets you track up to 150,000 AWS Lambda invocations a month, but today they're offering Serverless Chats listeners a special promotion. Sign up for a free account at lumigo.io and enter promo code CHATS500, and your free account limit will go up to 500,000 monthly invocations. That's lumigo.io with promo code CHATS500 to try it out today.
All right, so let me ask you a couple questions about Lambda and functions as a service, because I know that you've spent quite a bit of time on this stuff. So I guess my, sort of a question, especially, maybe even from a cloud economist, what's sort of next for Lambda and functions as a service? Because I know you've written about the Lambda containers, but like, what's maybe that next evolution?
What AWS did recently when they released Lambda containers is basically put it at feature parity with Azure and GCP, which already had that ability. They had either a function service or a functions adjacent service where you could upload your own container. And they finally released the base image where, granted, if you knew where to look, you could get it before, but they actually released it and announced it to the general public, so you don't have to know someone in order to be able to use it. So what I see a lot of people being able to do with this now is they really want to do local development testing, so they don't have to push anything to their account and rack up those charges, when all you want to do is make sure that that whatever one-line update you made actually worked and you didn't put the space or the tab in the wrong place, which is, I guess, how it works now. And it takes down the entire stack, which, again, we've all done at least once. So don't worry about it. If you've ever taken down production, don't worry. You are not the only one. I promise
alone.
you.
Right.
You cannot You can't throw a t-shirt into an empty conference room and not hit a dude who took down production. Yeah, I'm gonna save that for later. But yeah, so local development testing, live simulation is a really big thing. I've seen asked to do full-on data science just on Lambda containers, so they don't have to use Kubernetes anymore, because it is. Speaking of cost stuff, it's easier to track cost-wise than Kubernetes is, because Kubernetes is purely consumption-based, and you have to tie a bunch of stuff together in order to make that tracking work.
Right.
So that would be great. And I think from here on in, a lot of the fast changes, they're not going to be front ends anymore. It's all going to be optimizations by the providers. You're not going to see much of that anymore. It's not like before where they would add like 3 more fields and make a blog post about it. I think everything is just going to be tuning from Lambda's perspective now. That and hooking it to more things, because they love their integrations. What good is Lambda if you can't integrate it to stuff?
Right. If you can't hook it up to events. So it's interesting though. I mean, this move to support containers as a packaging format. And you're right. This has been available. I think this has been available in IBM. It's been available in Google. Yeah. It's been available in Microsoft. Like these capabilities have existed for a while to use a container. And again, that's a very overloaded word, I know, but to use that as a packaging format. But moving to that, the parity there with the other cloud providers is one thing. But like, who's that conversation for? Like, why? Like, whose mind does that change about serverless?
The
or
security
FaaS,
teams.
I guess. Security. Okay.
It's because if you talk to any engineer, if it's a technical problem, they'll find a way to fix it. That's just the way, especially at the individual contributor level. That's how the brain works. It's like, this is a small thing. I bet I can fix it with a few days or a weekend. Weekend turns into a month, but that's a completely different problem. I've had clients who did not want to use Lambda because they could not control the containerization system. So you would be pushing your code into containers that were owned by Amazon, and the way they saw that as a liability. Mm-hmm. So while it does have some very strong technical implications, because you're now able to choose the kind of runtime you do easier than trying to hamstring layers together, because I know layers is supposed to fix this problem, but it's so hard. It's so hard for something that you should be able to download off of Docker and then play with it and then put it back. And it's so unnecessarily hard, and it makes me so angry. But you can also, if you're willing to incur that responsibility, you can tweak your memory. You have more technical control, but also you have more control at a business level too. And that is a conversation that will go way easier as far as adoption.
Right. And then, I mean, the other thing in terms of, I guess the complexity of running K8s, right, or running Kubernetes is one of those things where that just seems like a lot of complexity, right? You mentioned the billing aspect of it and trying to track costs. I mean, if you're really trying, not that everyone's trying to narrow down exactly how much this Lambda container ran, I don't know, maybe you have more insight into that than I do, but the idea of just the complexity, and it seems to me that if you start thinking about cost, that the total cost of ownership of running a container in a Lambda function or running it in Fargate versus having to install and maintain. I mean, even if you're using, one of the managed services like EKS or something like that, that the total cost of ownership of going down the serverless route has got to be better. Yeah,
especially if you're one of these apps that are very user-generated based. So you're tracking mostly events and content, right? And not even a huge amount of content. You're not streaming video. You're just sharing pictures or sharing like if you're trying to rebuild Foursquare, you would just be sharing geodata, which is comparatively an extremely small piece of data. You don't need an entire instance or an entire container to do that. You can do that on a very small scale and build that out really quickly. That said, if you go from one of these 3-person teams and then there's interest in your product for whatever reason and it explodes, then you're not just your cost, but if you had to manage the traffic of that, if you had to manage the actual resources of that, and you did not think your usage would hockey stick and with your bill, that's not great. And being able to, even at least in the first few years of a company, just use Lambda for everything, that's probably just a safer solution because you're still rapidly iterating and you're still changing things very quickly and you're still transmitting very small bits of data. That said, it's like there are also large enterprise companies that are heavy Lambda users. And even their Lambda bill compared to their Kubernetes bill is if you rounded it down their Kubernetes bill, you would get their Lambda bill.
Right. Gotcha. I think that's really interesting because I actually would love to know your thoughts and whether you even see this. I don't know if we have enough data yet to know this, but this idea of using Lambda, especially early on in startups or even projects within an enterprise, being able to have that flexibility and the low operational overhead and so forth, I think is really great. But do you see that, or is that something that you think will happen? Is you'll kind of get to a point where you'll say we've found some sort of stability point with this product where we now need to move it over to something like Kubernetes or some sort of management or container management system because we'll just have, overall it's going to end up being cheaper in the long run?
What usually happens when you're making that transition from Lambda to even ECS or Fargate or eventually Kubernetes is that your business logic has now become so complex, or your infrastructure requirements have become so complex that Lambda can't do it cleanly anymore. So you end up maxing out on either memory or CPU utilization, or because you're apparently Lambda has a limit on how many times you can invoke it at the same time, which some people have hit in real life. So those are times when it stops being a cheaper solution and it stops being a tighter solution because you can run your own FaaS environment within instances. And then you can have a similar environment to what you're building, so you don't have to rebuild everything, but you don't have to incur that on-demand cost anymore. So that's one path I've seen someone take, and that's usually the decision, is that Lambda before, when it was limited, can't hold it. Now that you can put your own container so long as it fits in that requirement, you can kind of pad that runway out a little bit, and you can stretch out how long you have before you do a full conversion to ECS like environment. But that is usually how it is, because you just try to overload, or you have maybe like 50 lambdas trying to support one application, which is totally a thing you can do. It may not be the best, even with step, even with everything else, when that becomes too complex, then you end up just going to containers anyway.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think that's interesting. And I think any company that grows to the point where that they need to start thinking about that next level of infrastructure, it's probably a good thing. It's probably a good it's a good point to start having those conversations. So So anyway, all right, I got just like one more question for you because I'm really interested. So you mentioned, the cloud, what you kind of do as a cloud economist, reading through, people's bills and things like that. Now I thought Corey just made this thing up, right? So I didn't even know this thing existed until sort of Corey comes out, and he probably coined the term. But in terms of like that,
That's what
for
he tells
people who are
people.
interested. Oh, he does tell people that, right? So he does, and I think he did. I will definitely give him credit there. But in terms of that role of being a cloud economist and having to look through people's bills and trying to find them ways to save it, that's pretty insane that we need people like you to do that, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a bananas job. I cannot believe this is a job that I'm actually doing. It's also a lot of fun, but if you think about it, that when I was starting out and everything was Lamb stack when I started, that was a hot new tech when I started, was a Lamb stack. And the solution to all of those problems were we're going to throw more hardware at it. And then the following question was, why are we spending so much on hardware? And their solution to that problem was, we're going to buy real estate to store all of the hardware on.
Right.
Now that you don't have to do that, you still have the problem of, I'm going to solve this problem by throwing more hardware at it. That's still a mindset that is alive and well. And you still end up with the same problem, except now you don't have the excuse that at least we own the facility that data is in, because you don't anymore. Mm-hmm. So that, and since you don't actually own the cases and the blades and everything, you don't have to worry about disposing of them and having to use stuff that you don't actually use anymore.
Right.
So a lot of my problems are, one of our services has gone out of control. We don't know why. And then I will tell you who is spending that money, and I will talk to that team to make sure that they know that it's happening. Because there are sometimes they don't even know it's happening. Like something got spun up into their account, and maybe it was a test bed, maybe it was a demo, maybe they hired a vendor to load something into their environment, and those costs got out of control. It's not like I'm going out trying to tell you that you did something wrong. It's like, this is where the problem is. Let's go find out what happened. Right. So, yeah, forensic cloud bill person, I'm going to workshop that into a business card, because that sounds way better than the title that Corey uses.
Forensic cloud accountant or something like that.
Yes.
No, I think it's also interesting that billing is and the bills you get from AWS are a leading indicator of of things that are potentially going wrong. And interesting, because I don't know if people connect this. I mean, maybe I'm a little I'm underestimating people here, but the idea that that a bill that runs, or that you're seeing, or EC2 instances cost spiking, or you're seeing, a higher load or higher bandwidth or things like that. Those can all be indicators of poorly written code. It can be indicators of, the bad compression or missing compression settings. I mean, all kinds of things that it can sort of jump out at you. And unless somebody's paying attention to those bills, I don't think most developers and most teams, they're not going to see that.
Yeah, and the only time they pay attention when things start spiraling out of control, and this sounds like an intuitive issue, and first thing people will do will go, we're going to log everything, and we're going to find out what the problem is. And
it's cost you more money.
There's a threshold where CloudWatch becomes very expensive.
Right, absolutely.
And then they hit that threshold, and now their bill is like 4 times as much.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot of the times it's misconfiguration. It's like very rarely does any product get to the point where they just can't. It's built so poorly that it can barely hold itself up. That's never been the case. It's always been, this has been turned off, or AWS also offers like S3 analytics, It's like those, but you have to turn them on per bucket. So that's not a policy that's usually written in anyone's AWS config. So when they launch it, they just launch it without any analytics. They don't know if the thing is supposed to be sending things to Glacier, if it's highly used data. There's no way to tell. So it's trying to find little holes like that where it seems like it shouldn't be a problem, but the minute it becomes a problem, it's because you spent $20,000.
Right. Yeah. No, you can spend money very, very fast in the cloud. I think that is a lesson learned by many, many people. So,
yeah. The difference between being on Metal and throwing hardware at a problem and being on the cloud and throwing hardware at a problem is that you can throw hardware at a problem at scale on the cloud.
Right. Exactly right. There's no sort of stopping point. Like we have to go buy new servers. Like no one will stop you. No, I mean, just maybe the credit card company or whatever. But anyways, Amy, you are doing some amazing work with that, because I actually find that to be very, very fascinating. And I think it in terms of what that can do and the need for it, it's a fascinating field and super interesting. And I mean, good for Corey for really digging into that and calling it out. And then again, for people like you who are willing to take that job, because that seems to me like pouring through those numbers can't be the most interesting thing to do, but it must feel good when you do find a way to save somebody some money.
It's extreme. Spreadsheets can be interesting. Again, it's like everything else about my job. If I try to explain why it's interesting, I just make it sound more boring.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's leave it there. So, Amy, thank you again for joining me. This was awesome. If people want to find out more about you, or maybe they have, horribly large AWS cloud bills, and they want to check out the Duckbill group, how do they do that?
Honestly, if you search for Corey Quinn, you can find the Duckbill group real fast. If you want to go talk to me, because I like doing community engagement, and I like doing talks, and I like roasting people on Twitter just about different stuff, you can hit me up on Twitter at NerdyPaws. If you want to be a professional, I'm also on LinkedIn under Amy Codes.
All right. And then you also have a website, amy-codes.com.
Amy-codes.com is the archive of all of my talks. It's currently only showing the talks from last year, because for some reason it suddenly became very hard to find a spot over the past year. Who knew?
I know a lot of people doing talks. But anyways, all right, Amy, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Had so much fun.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Amy Arambulo Negrette for being my guest this week, and to our sponsors CBT Nuggets and Lumigo. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/102. For more Serverless Chats, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily. And if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.